What happens when a carefully orchestrated late-night interview spirals completely out of control, turning into a verbal battleground that nobody saw coming? Tonight, we dive into the explosive confrontation that left audiences stunned and producers scrambling. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because this story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about celebrity interviews. The atmosphere in Studio 6A was electric as Jimmy Kimmel settled into his chair, flipping through his note cards one final time. The familiar hum of the audience's anticipation filled the air, but something felt different tonight. There was an undercurrent of tension that even the seasoned host couldn't quite place his finger on. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Meghan Markle," Jimmy announced with his trademark grin, but his eyes betrayed a hint of uncertainty as the former royal walked onto the stage. Meghan emerged wearing an elegant black blazer, her smile perfectly practiced as she waved to the audience. But Jimmy noticed something in her posture, a stiffness that suggested this wasn't going to be the typical promotional chat he had prepared for. "Thank you for having me, Jimmy," Meghan said as she settled into the guest chair, her voice carrying a subtle edge that made Jimmy's media instincts prickle with warning. "Of course, it's great to have you here," Jimmy replied, maintaining his professional warmth while mentally recalibrating his approach. "So you've been keeping busy since stepping back from royal duties. Tell us what you've been up to." Meghan's laugh came out sharper than expected. "Well, Jimmy, that's an interesting way to phrase it. Stepping back suggests it was entirely our choice, doesn't it?" The audience shifted uncomfortably, sensing the interview was already veering off its expected course. Jimmy's years of experience kicked in as he tried to steer things back to safer ground. "I think most people understand it was a difficult decision for you and Harry," he said carefully. "But it seems like you've both found your footing in California. Have we, though?" Meghan leaned forward slightly, her media training evident, but her frustration beginning to seep through. "Because from where I'm sitting, it feels like every move we make gets twisted into something it's not. Every interview, every appearance, every charitable endeavor gets dissected and manipulated." Jimmy felt the familiar weight of a live television moment balancing on a knife's edge. He'd navigated countless celebrity meltdowns, but something about Meghan's energy tonight felt particularly volatile. "I think that comes with the territory of public life," he said diplomatically. "The media attention can be intense, but surely there are positives too." "Positives?" Meghan's voice rose slightly, causing the studio audience to fall into an uncomfortable silence. "Jimmy, do you have any idea what it's like to have your every word scrutinized by people who've already decided who you are before you even open your mouth?" The seasoned host recognized the signs of an interview about to go completely sideways. His production team was probably already having heart palpitations in the control room, but Jimmy's instinct was to lean into the moment rather than shut it down. "I imagine it's incredibly challenging," he said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "But isn't that something you knew would come with marrying into the royal family?" Meghan's eyes flashed with something that made Jimmy immediately realize he'd just lit a fuse he couldn't unlight. "Knew would come with it?" she repeated, her voice dropping to a dangerous quiet that somehow felt louder than shouting. "Jimmy, what exactly are you implying? That I should have expected to be vilified in the press? That I should have anticipated having my character assassinated on a daily basis?" The studio audience was now completely silent, the tension so thick it was almost visible. Jimmy could feel his producer's eyes boring into him from the control booth, probably making frantic hand gestures he was choosing to ignore. "That's not what I meant at all," Jimmy said, trying to inject some levity back into the moment. "I just think that anyone marrying into that level of public scrutiny has to be prepared for intense media attention." "Prepared for media attention." "Yes," Meghan said, her composure cracking further. "Prepared for a systematic campaign to destroy my reputation? That's something entirely different, and I think you know that." Jimmy felt the interview slipping away from him entirely. In 15 years of hosting, He'd rarely encountered a guest so determined to turn what should have been a friendly chat into something resembling a public therapy session. "Meghan, I think we might be getting a bit intense here," he said with a forced chuckle, glancing toward the audience as if to remind her they weren't alone. "Maybe we could talk about some of the positive projects you're working on?" "Intense?" Meghan's voice carried a note of incredulity that made Jimmy's stomach drop. "You think I'm being intense? Jimmy, do you know what intense is? Intense is reading headlines that call you a narcissist every single day. Intense is having people question your mental health because you dared to speak your truth." The host could see his carefully planned interview completely derailing, but his professional instincts told him to keep the conversation moving forward rather than shut it down entirely. "I understand you've faced criticism," he said, "but don't. You think some of the pushback comes from how you've chosen to respond to that criticism?" The moment the words left Jimmy's mouth, he knew he'd crossed a line. Meghan's face transformed, her media-trained smile disappearing entirely as she leaned back in her chair with a look that could have frozen fire. "How I've chosen to respond," she said slowly, each word carefully enunciated. "Are you seriously suggesting that defending myself against lies and manipulation is somehow inappropriate?" Jimmy realized he was now in completely uncharted territory. The interview had become something he'd never experienced before, a live television confrontation with no clear path back to normalcy. "That's not what I'm saying," he replied, but even he could hear how weak his response sounded. "I'm just wondering if sometimes silence might be more powerful than engaging with critics." Meghan stood up so abruptly that her chair rolled backward, the sudden movement causing several audience members to gasp audibly. "Silence," she said, her voice now carrying an edge that made the entire studio feel like a powder keg. "Jimmy, silence is exactly what they want. Silence is what allows lies to become truth and manipulation to become narrative." Jimmy felt the weight of every eye in the studio as he tried to process what was happening. In his entire career, he'd never had a guest stand up in the middle of an interview like this, and the electric tension in the room was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. "Meghan, please, let's sit down and talk about this," he said, his voice steady but his mind racing through possible ways to salvage the situation. "I think we're having a miscommunication here." "A miscommunication?" Meghan remained standing, her posture rigid with barely contained fury. "No, Jimmy, I think we're communicating perfectly clearly. You're suggesting I should stay quiet while people destroy my reputation, and I'm telling you that's not going to happen." The audience sat in stunned silence, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats as they witnessed what felt more like a private argument than a television interview. Jimmy could practically feel his producers having collective heart attacks in the control room. "That's really not what I meant," Jimmy said, standing up as well in an attempt to level the playing field. "I'm just trying to understand your perspective on how to handle media criticism." "My perspective?" Meghan's laugh was devoid of any warmth. "Jimmy, do you want to know my perspective? My perspective is that I spent years being told to keep quiet, to not defend myself, to let other people control my narrative. And look where that got me." Jimmy recognized he was in dangerous territory, but his instinct as an interviewer was to keep probing rather than retreat completely. "But don't you think there's a difference between defending yourself and, well, some might say attacking back?" "Attacking back?" Meghan's voice rose again, causing several people in the front row to visibly flinch. "Jimmy, when someone punches you in the face, defending yourself isn't attacking back. It's survival." The host felt the conversation spiraling into territory he'd never navigated before. His usual arsenal of jokes and deflections seemed completely inadequate for the raw emotion now filling his studio. "I hear what you're saying," he said carefully, "but from an outside perspective, sometimes it can look like you're fighting battles that might be better left unfought." "An outside perspective," Meghan repeated, her tone dripping with disdain. "You mean a perspective from someone who's never had their every breath scrutinized?" Someone who's never had their family relationships dissected in tabloids? Someone who's never been called a liar for telling their own truth? Jimmy could see his security team shifting nervously near the stage exits, clearly unsure whether this situation was about to require their intervention. The atmosphere had become so charged that even the camera operators seemed frozen in place. "Look, I'm not trying to minimize what you've been through," Jimmy said, attempting to inject some empathy into his voice. "But as someone who's been in media for a long time, sometimes the best response to criticism is to let your work speak for itself." "Let my work speak for itself?" Meghan's voice cracked with emotion. "Jimmy, they don't report on my work. They report on manufactured drama and invented controversies. When was the last time you saw a headline about the actual charitable work I do?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Jimmy realized he couldn't actually answer it. In that moment of silence, he understood that Meghan had just scored a point that even he couldn't counter. "You're right," he admitted, his honesty surprising even himself. "The media does tend to focus on conflict rather than positive work." "Finally," Meghan said, but there was no satisfaction in her voice, only exhaustion. "So when you tell me to stay quiet and let my work speak for itself, you're essentially telling me to let lies become the only narrative people hear about me." Jimmy felt like he was walking through a minefield where every step could trigger an explosion. His years of experience had taught him to find common ground with guests, but Meghan seemed determined to reject any attempt at reconciliation. "But surely there has to be some middle ground," he said. "Some way to defend yourself without it becoming a public battle every time." "Middle ground?" Meghan's laugh was bitter. "Jimmy, I tried middle ground. I tried taking the high road. I tried being dignified and silent. Do you know what happened? They filled that silence with their own stories about who I was and what I believed." The studio audience was so quiet that Jimmy could hear the air conditioning humming overhead. He'd never experienced anything like this on live television, and part of him was genuinely impressed by Meghan's refusal to back down, even as another part of him worried about where this was all heading. "So what's the alternative?" he asked, genuinely curious now, despite the uncomfortable situation. "You fight every battle. You respond to every criticism. The alternative," Meghan said, her voice growing stronger, "is that I tell my own story instead of letting other people tell it for me. The alternative is that I refuse to be painted as a villain just because it makes for better headlines." Jimmy nodded slowly, beginning to understand the depth of frustration that had been building up inside his guest. But his role as a host required him to play devil's advocate, even in this increasingly volatile situation. "But doesn't that risk making you look defensive?" he asked. "Doesn't it sometimes give more attention to the very criticisms you're trying to counter?" The question seemed to hit Meghan like a physical blow. Her face flushed with anger, and for a moment, Jimmy wondered if she might actually walk off the stage entirely. "Defensive?" she said, her voice now shaking with rage. "Jimmy, if someone was spreading lies about you every single day, wouldn't you defend yourself? Or would you just sit there and let them destroy everything you've worked for?" Jimmy realized he'd pushed too far, but he also recognized that backing down completely would make him look weak to his audience. He was caught between his professional instincts and the increasingly personal nature of the confrontation. "I'd probably try to find a way to rise above it," he said, immediately regretting the words as soon as they left his mouth. "Rise above it?" Meghan repeated slowly, her voice now dangerously quiet. "Jimmy, that's exactly the kind of privileged advice that people give when they've never actually faced real adversity. It's easy to talk about rising above it when you're not the one being torn apart." The accusation of privilege hit Jimmy harder than he'd expected. He prided himself on being relatable and down to earth, but Meghan's words forced him to confront the reality that his experience was fundamentally different from hers. "That's not fair," he said, his own voice taking on an edge for the first time in the interview. "I've dealt with plenty of criticism in my career." "Have you?" Meghan challenged, stepping closer to his desk, in a move that made the entire studio hold its breath. Have you had your mental health questioned because you spoke honestly about your experiences? Have you been called manipulative for defending yourself against lies? Jimmy felt the studio air grow thick with tension as Meghan's questions hung between them like accusations. The confrontation had moved far beyond anything resembling a normal interview, and he could see his crew exchanging worried glances from the corners of his vision. "You're right," Jimmy said finally, his voice quieter but more serious than it had been all evening. "I haven't experienced that level of personal attack, but I also haven't put myself in situations where that kind of scrutiny was inevitable." The moment the words left his mouth, Jimmy knew he'd made a critical error. Meghan's face transformed completely, her expression shifting from anger to something approaching fury. "Put myself in situations?" she said, her voice trembling with rage. "Jimmy, are you seriously suggesting that I brought this on myself? That marrying someone I loved was putting myself in a situation I deserved to be punished for?" The studio audience gasped audibly at the exchange, and Jimmy could feel the interview slipping completely beyond his control. His producer was frantically gesturing from the booth, but Jimmy was too deep in the moment to back down now. "That's not what I said," he replied, but even he could hear how weak his defense sounded. "I'm saying that when you marry into the royal family, intense media attention comes with the territory." "Intense media attention, yes," Meghan shot back, her voice now carrying a sharp edge that cut through the studio like a blade. "Racist attacks and deliberate character assassination? No. There's a difference, Jimmy. And the fact that you can't see it is exactly the problem." Jimmy felt like he'd been slapped. The accusation of not understanding racism hung in the air between them, and he realized that this interview had moved into territory where his usual charm and deflection tactics were completely useless. "I'm not trying to minimize the racial aspects of what you faced," he said carefully, "but I think we're getting into some pretty heavy accusations here that might be better discussed in a different setting." "A different setting?" Meghan's laugh was harsh and bitter. "You mean somewhere off camera where it's convenient for everyone to pretend these issues don't exist?" "Jimmy, this is exactly what I'm talking about. The moment things get real, the moment someone speaks truth to power, suddenly it's inappropriate. For public consumption." Jimmy could see his security team moving closer to the stage, clearly preparing for the possibility that they might need to intervene. The situation had deteriorated beyond anything he'd experienced in decades of television. "Meghan, I think we need to take a step back here," he said, trying to inject some authority into his voice. "This is my show, and I'm not comfortable with the direction this conversation is heading." "Your show?" Meghan repeated, her voice dripping with contempt. "Of course it's your show, and on your show, I'm supposed to sit quietly and let you frame my experiences however you see fit, right? I'm supposed to be grateful for the platform while you minimize everything I've been through." Jimmy felt his professional patience finally beginning to crack. He'd tried to be understanding. He'd tried to be diplomatic, but Meghan seemed determined to turn his show into her personal battleground. "I've been more than fair to you tonight," he said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "I've let you say things that frankly cross several lines, and I've tried to have a respectful conversation despite your obvious hostility." "My hostility?" Meghan's voice rose to a level that made several audience members physically recoil. "Jimmy, you've spent this entire interview suggesting that I should shut up and take abuse quietly. You've minimized my experiences and questioned my right to defend myself. And now you're calling me hostile for refusing to accept that treatment?" The confrontation had reached a fever pitch, and Jimmy could see his production team making increasingly frantic gestures from the control room. He realized that this interview was rapidly becoming a disaster that could damage his reputation for years to come. "I think we need to end this interview," he said firmly, his host persona finally giving way to genuine authority. "This has gone way beyond what's appropriate for late-night television." "Of course you want to end it," Meghan said, her voice, now shaking with a mixture of rage and what sounded like tears. "The moment I refuse to play the role you've assigned me, the moment I fight back against your narrative, you want to shut me down. This is exactly what I've been talking about." Jimmy felt trapped between his responsibility to his show and his genuine desire to be fair to his guest. But Meghan's behavior had crossed every professional boundary he'd ever established, and he knew he had to take control of the situation. "Meghan, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," he said, the words feeling surreal as they came out of his mouth. "This isn't working, and it's not fair to my audience or my crew to continue this." "Ask me to leave?" Meghan's voice cracked with emotion. "Jimmy, are you actually kicking me off your show because I refuse to let you paint me as the villain?" The studio fell into complete silence, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Jimmy could feel the weight of every decision that had led to this moment, and he knew that whatever happened next would define how this confrontation would be remembered. "I'm ending this interview because it's become inappropriate," he said, firmly. "You've turned what should have been a conversation into a personal attack, and I won't allow that to continue on my show." Meghan stared at him for a long moment, her eyes blazing with an intensity that made Jimmy genuinely uncomfortable. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but filled with a fury that seemed to vibrate through the entire studio. "You're proving my point perfectly, Jimmy," she said. "A woman refuses to be silenced, refuses to accept being painted as the problem, and immediately she's labeled as inappropriate and removed from the conversation. Thank you for giving me the perfect example of exactly what I've been fighting against." With that, Meghan turned and walked toward the stage exit, her heels clicking against the floor in the absolute silence that had fallen over the studio. Jimmy watched her go, part of him feeling like he'd just witnessed something historic, and part of him wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake. As the studio doors closed behind her, Jimmy turned back to his stunned audience, trying to process what had just happened and figure out how to salvage the remainder of his show. "Well," he said finally, his voice carrying a mixture of exhaustion and bewilderment, "that was certainly not what any of us expected tonight." The audience remained silent, still processing the confrontation they'd just witnessed, and Jimmy realized that this interview would be talked about for years to come, though probably not in the way anyone had originally intended. What did you think of this explosive confrontation? Have you ever seen an interview go this wrong before? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more incredible celebrity moments that you won't see anywhere else.